Today, we're going to talk about copywriting. Advertising copywriting is not dead. A lot of times we think that it is. We don't see as much long copy used in advertising as we saw decades past. We're going to look at a few older ads that are quite long in terms of their copy and look at their structures. And we don't see a lot of that in a lot of 2D advertising, but there really is still a lot of good copy that's written, and copywriting is a very important means of persuasion in advertising, especially in digital advertising, which you might not think of off the top of your head. But a lot of digital advertising, a lot of video advertising is very dependent on good persuasive copy. Okay. This quote here, Howard Luck Gossage, you probably haven't heard of him. I kind of wish you had. He was a contemporary of people like Ogilvy and Bernbach and Burnett, the people you learn about in the era of creativity in your Principles of Advertising course. And so he was a contemporary of them, but his agency wasn't as big, wasn't as successful, and so he doesn't get quite as much notoriety as those other agency owners did. But trivia fact on Gossage, Howard Luck Gossage was the person who first kind of publicized and helped make Marshall McLuhan famous. You may remember McLuhan's name from your mass media and society course. But anyway, I love this quote by Gossage because it gets to the crux of how we as consumers approach advertising. We don't approach it as advertising or entertainment or anything like that. We approach content as content. And people don't read advertising, they read what interests them. And if what interests them is an ad, they'll read it. If it doesn't interest them, they won't. All right, let's jump right in and talk about some tips for writing headlines. First tip, use imperative sentences if you want the reader to take action. What's an imperative sentence? Think back to your high school English grammar classes. An imperative sentence is one where it takes the form of a command. Often the subject of that imperative structure is you, second person, so it's in second person voice. But often that subject is implied rather than explicitly stated. It's called the you understood construction. And so if you want the reader to take some sort of action, tell them to do it. That makes sense, right? So here's an example. We'll use Harley Davidson as kind of our example in this lecture. So if you're writing an ad for Harley Davidson and the goal is to get people to visit a dealership or go to the website or go buy a new Harley Davidson, you might want to use an imperative sentence structure. Okay. Here would be an example. Buy a Harley Davidson and live. Buy is the verb in the first sentence here. And it is second person construction. You is the subject, but you is implied. So this is an imperative sentence, buy a Harley Davidson. And in fact, the second sentence is also an imperative sentence structure. Live is the verb, and you understood or you implied is the subject. Use questions if you want to increase reader involvement. Okay. It's a very natural thing. In fact, it's an almost involuntary response for us as humans. If somebody asks you a question, you answer it. You may not verbalize that answer, but mentally you will formulate an answer to a question. You just really can't help it, can you? I just asked you a question, can you? And some of you probably said mentally, no, I don't always answer a question, but you would have if you mentally answered no, right? That's an answer. So use questions if you want to increase reader involvement because we really can't help but involve with that text and formulate an answer to it. One caveat. A question headline like this is a yes or no question. And you want to be careful with yes or no questions because a lot of people will answer no and then they won't continue to read the ad. So if you write a headline that sounds fine, such as, ever wonder how exhilarating it would be to ride a Harley Davidson, there'll be a lot of people whose answer is, no, I never really have. And now you've not prompted them to read further. The people who answer yes might, but you've just blocked off a lot of your potential readers. So it's better probably to phrase a question as an open-ended question. And you'll increase your reader involvement that way, or increase the number of people who respond to that question positively. Okay, so what would it feel like? Just you, the open road, and your brand new Harley Davidson. You can't answer that one yes or no. It asks you to formulate and think about what it would feel like. And so that's probably a more effective question if you want to draw the reader into the copy. Next, offer a benefit. Well, the first headline that we saw there, buy a Harley Davidson and live is the benefit. That's what you're going to get out of it. You're going to live a fuller, more rich life, exhilarating, feeling exhilarated. That's a benefit. We'll talk a little bit more about benefits, how they relate to features, but a benefit simply answers the question for the consumer, what's in it for me? And so benefits are almost always an effective way of formulating a headline if you're trying to persuade rather than just arouse curiosity or build brand awareness. Offer news. If you have something that is new and compelling, and that's the purpose of your advertising, get it right up front in the headline there. But most of all, make your headlines interesting. You've got to write something that engages the reader, that is kind of interesting and is memorable, that makes that reader say, aha, I get it. A lot of times the creative concept is carried through the headline. Okay, little commercial break here. Former ad copywriters turned famous authors. Let's see how many of these you've heard of. Salman Rushdie became famous for writing a poetic novel called The Satanic Verses. Kurt Vonnegut Jr., probably my favorite American author, known for Slaughterhouse-Five, among many other novels and nonfiction works and volumes of short stories. And this one I know you've heard of, F. Scott Fitzgerald. All of these people and many other well-accomplished writers actually started out in advertising copywriting. Okay, this ad for Jordan Automobiles, Jordan Motor Car Company, appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1923. I found this ad in a collection, a book called The 100 Greatest Ads of the 20th Century. And it's considered such a great ad because of the copy. It's an example, a very early example of what's called transformational advertising copy rather than informational advertising copy. This ad doesn't tell you a thing about the car. What it tells you about is the experience and connecting with a reader. And in a way, in 1920s type of language, but it's a very emotional kind of appeal that we typically did not see with automobile advertising in the 1920s. So the title, the headline, Somewhere West of Laramie, town in Wyoming, right? Interesting headline, right? It's curious. It piques your interest a little bit. And that's its purpose, is to draw you down into the copy. Then it repeats this and gets into the language, some of which is going to seem silly to you, but I'll just read it. Somewhere west of Laramie, there's a bronco-busting, steer-roping girl who knows what I'm talking about. She can tell you what a sassy pony that's a cross between greased lightning and the place where it hits can do with 1,100 pounds of steel and action when he's going high, wide, and handsome. I think they're talking about the car there a little bit. The truth is, the Playboy, I think that's the model of the car, the Playboy was built for her. Built for the lass whose face is brown with the sun when the day is done of revel and romp and race. Note the alliteration there. She loves the cross of the wild and the tame. There's a savor of lynx about that car, of laughter and lilt and light, a hint of old loves and saddle and quirt. Quirt is the braiding in the lasso rope. It's a brawny thing, yet a graceful thing for the sweep of the avenue. Step into the Playboy when the hour grows dull with things gone dead and stale. Then start for the land of real living with the spirit of the lass who rides lean and rangy into the red horizon of a Wyoming twilight. Now, this is very aspirational copy, and no, you would not write copy like this today. At least I hope you wouldn't. But I hope it kind of illustrates the point of the difference between copy that is really connecting to the emotions versus copy that is trying to connect to your rational brain. And this is all about your emotional side of your brain. Maybe it didn't work so well for Jordan. The Jordan Motor Car Company did not stay in business very long. So maybe the readers of the 1920s weren't quite ready for this type of appeal. I don't know. But this is a pretty good example of a historic advertising copy block that really uses this transformational advertising style. Next one. The famous Rolls-Royce ad by David Ogilvy. Ogilvy, in one of his books, wrote that he considered this ad one of the best he had ever written. And that's saying something, because Ogilvy thought pretty much everything he did was pretty brilliant. He also said in this book that he would spend 90% of the time that he was writing an ad, he would spend it on the headline. And as you can see here, he wrote long copy. So that's how important it was to him to get the headline exactly right. And this is one of his most famous headlines. At 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock. Okay, now that's a feature type of headline. It's telling you a detail about the vehicle. It's not telling you what that does for you, although you can certainly imply that it's a quiet ride. But it's focused on the product performance, as is a lot in this car. But in this advertising copy. But what I wanted to point out here is the way in which Ogilvy kind of weaves back and forth between product features and consumer benefits. The product feature tells you something specific about the product. It describes its attributes, its performance, it could be its price, but it describes things that are concrete and knowable about the product. That's a feature. The benefit is what that feature does for me or you, the consumer. Okay? So a lot of times there's this formula in advertising copy where you first state a feature and then you follow it up by making very clear to the reader, this feature does X for you. So feature, then benefit. And sometimes you transfer it around and do benefit first and feature. But a lot of times in advertising copy, you will combine these so that the features and the benefits work together. Okay, so you can see here there's the headline that we talked about, the subhead, what makes Rolls-Royce the best car in the world? There's really no magic about it. It is merely patient attention to detail, says an eminent Rolls-Royce engineer. Okay, so this is taking almost a journalistic kind of approach. This is also a Saturday Evening Post ad from 1959. And then you can see the copy is written almost like we would do bullet points now. It's written in a numerical fashion, each paragraph becoming a separate point. But let's look at a couple of the features and benefits. Down here at number 4, it says, the car has power steering, power brakes, and automatic gear shift. Those are 3 features about the product. Next sentence, and the next 2 sentences, he follows it up with what that means to you, what the benefits are. So power steering, power brakes, automatic gear shift. Then it is very easy to drive and to park. No chauffeur required. Okay, and that no chauffeur required, the audience here is kind of an upper middle class woman who aspires to having all the great things in life that the late 1950s and that mythical time could afford the upper middle class. And so she's aspiring to this. And that cue is you can have a Rolls Royce and you can actually drive it yourself. And you maybe can't afford a chauffeur, but with this Rolls Royce, it becomes kind of a mark of pride that you don't need a chauffeur. See what he did there? Okay, the next point, let's look at number 6 there. The Rolls-Royce is guaranteed for 3 years, and then with a new network of dealers and parts depots from coast to coast, there's the feature, service is no problem. That's the benefit. I can get this car serviced anywhere. Okay, let's look down at number 9. By moving a switch on the steering column, that's the feature. You can adjust the shock absorbers to suit road conditions. That's the benefit. It's easy for me to adjust the shock absorbers. Okay, I guess back in the 1950s, that was maybe more of an issue, the road quality and things like that. Point 12, there are 3 separate systems of power brakes, 2 hydraulic and 1 mechanical. Okay, that's some detailed feature copy there. What's the benefit? Damage to one system will not affect the others. The Rolls-Royce is a very safe car and also a very lively car. There's your second benefit. And then it follows up with the feature, it cruises serenely at 85. All right, you can see how kind of features and benefits play off of each other and work together to kind of make the product more concrete, what it does and what it does for me in the consumer's mind. Okay, this one is a Howard Gossage ad, which is why I started with him. I'm not going to read the ad. It's a parody ad, obviously, of the Rolls-Royce ad. He got Ogilvy's permission to run this, but at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Land Rover comes from the roar of the engine, and then wrote it exactly the way Ogilvy would, except tongue-in-cheek. All right, some more tips for writing headlines. Identify the target audience. Now, you can't do all these tips in every headline. These are things to kind of think about, give yourself a checklist if you're having trouble, kind of try out different versions of headline. But one good technique is to identify the target audience. That could be by kind of calling them out, or more likely in today's copywriting, it would be writing the copy of the headline kind of in the vernacular, in the language of your target audience so that they identify with that voice and know that you're speaking to them. Identify the brand in the headline. This is an especially good tip if your brand has low awareness, and building awareness is your main objective. Then get that name right up front and center, maybe repeat it a couple times in the body copy, and then also have good branding, good use of the logo, product packages, and things like that. But if you want to build awareness, think about getting the brand name in the headline. Okay, relate the headline to the illustration. We've already talked about that from a creative concepting standpoint, the headline visual interaction, where one doesn't make sense without the other. So you relate it to the illustration without just summarizing what the illustration is. Make sure the headline comes from the strategy. You should be able to see your consumer insight somewhere in that headline, or you should be able to see your communication objective somewhere in that headline. So kind of keep these things in mind. No, you can't do every single tip in all your headlines, but these will kind of help you narrow the focus of your headline writing. But mostly, make it interesting. Headlines have to be interesting. They're that important for the consumer to have a positive attitude, a positive experience with the ad, and not just look at it as one of 1,000 other advertising messages they're going to see that day. All right, let's do a little experiment here. Here's a Harley-Davidson ad, and I've blocked out the headline. And so you see the picture window layout, the big, expansive, wide open spaces, the solitary rider on the open highway. You get the mood and the feel there, right? Let me read the copy to you and then kind of think about how would you write a headline to go with this. So here's the copy. Give us life at ground level, rolling along the endless highway on a Harley-Davidson, 100% depressurized. Just sunlight on chrome, the voice of a V-twin ripping the open air, an elbow room stretching all the way to the horizon. Sounds a little bit like that Somewhere West of Laramie kind of style, right? Except a little bit more up to date. Stretching all the way to the horizon. Maybe you too think this is the way life ought to be lived. Time to spread some wings. And then the contact information, call to action, and the legend rolls on is the theme line there. So what would you put there for a headline? I mean, the obvious thing is to say something like, get out on the open road and enjoy your freedom on a Harley, right? Here's what this headline writer wrote. Somewhere on an airplane, a man is trying to rip open a small bag of peanuts. And what you get is this reversal, right? Instead of the headline stating what's in the image, the headline gives you what you're not experiencing in the image and what everybody wants to get away from. It's really, really kind of a crafty way of approaching this business of writing a headline that's going to pull the reader in and hit the right emotional tone. Okay, ways to make headlines more creative. Create ambiguity or double entendres in the headline. Ambiguity means something that can be taken two ways. It could have two different meanings. And a double entendre is just a special case of ambiguity. It's usually something that is a little bit risque, often sexual innuendo. So you have to be careful with that you might be offending some of your audience, but they're usually kind of jokes kind of thing. So you have to be careful with them, but they can work on occasion well. But this idea of ambiguity is kind of a double meaning here. So I do wish we could chat longer, but I'm having an old friend for dinner. You don't necessarily note the ambiguity until you know who said it. Hannibal Lecter. Okay, that's a good example of kind of a double entendre in the case that it's kind of shocking and maybe not all that socially appropriate, right, for conversation, but it isn't necessarily sexual in nature. Okay, twisting a cliche. Okay, so with twisting a cliche, you take a well-known phrase that everybody knows, and we want to avoid just using cliches in advertising copy, but if you can find a clever way to reframe it, a clever way to maybe relate it to the brand or to the strategy, then cliches can be quite useful. You just have to tweak them a little bit. That's involved with twisting a cliche. So if we take the Harley Davidson example and the cliche of going nowhere fast, even just a slight twist on that, go nowhere really fast, relates it back to what the product's all about, right? So you're kind of twisting the cliche. Sometimes the twisting the cliche involves substituting the brand name for one word in the cliche or something like that. But if you're really stuck on headlines, this is often a pretty good source to kind of get some inspiration. Google some cliches that contain a word that you want to use in the headline, or Google some cliches that kind of capture the action that you're talking about in the headline, and then play around with them, and you might find something really useful there. Parallelism. We talked about that when we talked about the creative concepting techniques of wordplay, but it's this idea of using the same syntactic structure. Often that's in like a two-sentence headline or in a headline subhead combination. It could be something like in Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities that starts out, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." That's parallelism. Puns. Advertising has a long history of using puns. Puns are not exactly real high humor. The benefit of puns is that everybody gets them. If they're clever, they are kind of fun. Some of them are groaners, so you have to test them well. But puns can be pretty useful in advertising because they're very easy to identify with. Something like this. Okay, let's look at some more ads. This for Volkswagen, and this is a good example of the headline not really making sense until you see the subhead. So this is kind of a headline, instead of a headline visual interaction, this is a headline subhead interaction. So you see this first because it's centered and there's all this negative space around it. I'll be there in the autocorrect while or wheelchair, and it confuses you, right? It creates some ambiguity. And then that's cleared up by "please don't text and drive." All right, the next ad, this is for the National Lottery in Lebanon. This is a double entendre, right? To tell your boss to get lost and CC your chairman, you need balls. That's the double entendre. Okay, so we've talked about some tips to make them more persuasive, the headlines. Some ways to maybe make them more creative if you're kind of getting stuck. And headline writing is hard. It takes lots and lots of drafts. Remember, Ogilvy spent 90% of his time in writing an ad on the headline. So don't just write it a couple times and think that's going to be good enough. Keep crafting it, keep tweaking it, keep playing with the words a little bit. The headline has to have no wasted words, and it has to really sing. Okay, so if you get stuck, One good tip is to write a bunch of body copy first. Even if you don't intend on using that copy or only using a little bit of it, write several drafts, several paragraphs of body copy. Sometimes you'll find there'll be some headlines ideas that will kind of be sparked by just by the process of writing some ad copy, something that you can build on. Use metaphors. So I think we've already talked about metaphors as a creative concepting technique. The beauty of metaphors is that a reader kind of enjoys them. They see the art, they see the creativity of the metaphor, and they transfer some appreciation for that, a good metaphor. They transfer that appreciation onto the brand. Use alliteration, another literary device. That's the repetition of initial consonant sound. But make it interesting. You kind of knew that was coming again, didn't you? Make it interesting. Establish voice. We talked about voice as a creative concepting technique. Remember those ads for Scrabble that were in the student portfolio, or for Jenny Craig weight loss centers. Just sometimes having a really authentic voice that is like the brand talking to the reader or the consumer. Sometimes that just works pretty well. Okay, good copy, it has a specific sound and rhythm, like a good speech. So advertising copy, even in 2D, something that is meant to be read and not heard, it should have a sound to it, because most of us, when we read, we hear the words as we read them, and amplify that power of the way we read so that you can get better effect for your headlines. Typically, body copy, write in first or second person. Okay, so first person is the I or we form. Second person is the you form. Or write in which you go back and forth between the I and the you, between first and second person. So when it's first person copy, you're speaking for the brand. Now, usually when you're writing first person advertising copy and you're talking about a brand, you use the we form. So you use the plural form of the first person. The only case when you would use I would be like if it's the president or the CEO of the company who is talking there. And then they're usually going to be pictured, and it's clear that that is one person speaking. But in general, if you're just kind of speaking as the voice of the brand in the first person, it's going to be a we. Second person, we talked about that. That's where you're talking directly to you. You're talking about here's what you probably feel. Here's what you're thinking right now. Here's what we want you to do. That kind of thing. Figure out who the speaker is. Okay, my tip for this is, if the brand is your speaker, treat your brand as if the brand was a person. And people have personality types. And so start to write and think about your brand as being a person, and write in the voice of that person. Okay? Is your brand male, female? Is your brand old, young? Is your brand like really smart and intellectual? Or is your brand just kind of fun to hang around with? All of those personality types are going to speak differently, aren't they? Write in the voice that you would most associate that brand being a person. Okay, then figure out how the speaker talks about the cliches. We tend to use how the speaker talks about the brand, we tend to write with a lot of cliches, especially in first drafts. And that's one of the reasons you need to go through and revise and kind of tighten your copy and things like that. And get rid of wasted words, get rid of cliches, unless you're going to twist the cliche. Typically, advertising body copy takes a somewhat different narrative structure than does regular expository writing. In advertising copy, we tend to use very short sentences, short paragraphs. Sentence fragments, if they're intentional, are fine. And short copy blocks. 100 words for a copy block is pretty long these days. And so that doesn't make it easier to write. It's actually more difficult to write short and to write effectively than it is if you're going to write several hundred words, because then you can get all of your points in, right? You want to make one really strong point in advertising copy, make it well, keep it short sentences, short paragraphs, short copy blocks. You can be loose with your grammar without being incorrect. Okay, so if you are going to make mistakes with your grammar, it should be pretty clear that it's intentional and that it's done in the voice of that particular brand or that particular personality of the brand. Now, that doesn't mean you can be incorrect. So you can't have incorrect use of your Y-O-U-R versus your Y-O-U apostrophe R-E or any of those other things that are just common errors that we make when we write fast and don't proofread. Use active verbs as opposed to linking verbs. So try to avoid the use of to be as a verb, the is verb. Also try to avoid passive construction. The more active you can make your sentence construction in body copy, the more the reader's going to kind of move through it quickly and maintain their interest. Limit your superlatives. Consumers are very turned off by advertising copy that is always saying we're the best, we're the greatest. Consumers today don't really like bragging. They kind of prefer brands that have more of a quiet confidence rather than just shouting at them and bragging all the time. Okay, here's a first ad in a campaign for Tesco. Tesco is a grocery store chain in the United Kingdom and uses a little humor in its advertising. And so this is a good example of using short sentences and a little bit of humorous copy to make one point about selling eggs. Okay, so eggs, a value for 52 pence, or finest free range for £1.95. Tricky, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Okay, so they're kind of twisting a cliche or using a cliche at the end, but it's applied to the idea of a half dozen eggs. In most countries besides the US, you're much more likely to buy eggs in a half dozen container than in a container of a dozen or 18 like you do here. Okay, second ad in the campaign, you see the same art direction style, you see the same layout style, just different color, different product, and different copy. Okay, Granny Smith's. What's the difference between ours and our competitors? Not much, really. They're the same quality as Waitrose and the same price as Asda. Waitrose and Asda are two other grocery store chains in the UK. So you can see fragment, short sentence, quick question, fragment, another short sentence, and here's the information part of it. You know, they're the same quality as Waitrose and same price as Asda. So that's very few words, and yet it gets its point across quickly, communicates well, and is fairly interesting copy. Okay, third, cheese can cause nightmares, like you shopping elsewhere. Scary. That's why this piece is only 87 pence. And the last one, soap, 24 pence. See, the more we sell, the less we charge. There's kind of your feature benefit, right? You scratch our back, we gently exfoliate yours. So there's the twist on the cliche. So it uses a lot of good techniques, a little kicker, a little humor at the end, and it gets into the copy block quickly, makes its point, gets out kind of on a light, funny note, and then it's done. No wasted words there. Okay, copy doesn't just mean print. I love this particular ad. It's a bit long, but look at this as an advertising copywriting kind of epic piece.
Shut it. Here's a true story about a young lad named John. Just a local farm boy. There was something special about the lad. A glint in his eye, a fire in his belly, a spring in his step. And one day, he went for a walk. Now this walk began when his father died. The year was 1819, and he was just 14 years old. Bereavement counselling. Well, these were the days when young boys were sent into the fields, the mills, the mines, tough times. But young John was smart enough to be lucky. His father's farm, where he was born and raised, was sold, and the proceeds used to open a grocer's. Big responsibility for the wee lad. his own shop in Kilmarnock, with his name on the door, John Walker. Or Johnny, as the world now knows him. Back then, all grocers stocked a range of local single malts, but they could be a wee bit inconsistent. For John, that wasn't good enough. He began blending different malts together as a way of offering his customers a consistent, unique product. Now this backroom art quickly developed into a commercial proposition, and a very profitable one. And because there's nothing like a commercial proposition to stir the Scottish heart, it grew quickly into an industry filled with ambitious entrepreneur distillers. John thrived in this environment, and so too soon with his sons, Robert and Alexander, who joined him on his journey. The Walkers became the biggest name in a rapidly growing industry. They were unstoppable. In one bold bit of 19th century corporate raiding, they bought the famed distillery at Cardew, lock, stock and ensuring their supply of this silky single malt, and guaranteeing, more importantly, that none of the other big blenders could get their hands on it. But young Alexander wasn't content with being Scotland's biggest blender. Not ambitious enough for him. No. He convinced the ship's captains of Glasgow to act as agents for him, and drove the whisky bearing his father's name across the globe. By 1860, he had developed the square bottle. Now, with a label at an angle of precisely 24 degrees. No big deal, you might think, but you'd be wrong. The square bottle meant less breakages and more bottles per shipment. The diagonal label meant larger type, and together, that meant Johnny Walker had unmistakable presence on any shelf in the world. The bottle became an icon, and the rich liquid it contained sought after and consumed across the globe. Quite a character, Alexander Walker. Master of the blender's art, ambitious, uncompromising, Mr. Walker. It was John's grandsons, George and Alexander II's turn to join him on his journey. They led the brand into the 20th century. By 1909, they had developed the iconic red label and black label, and persuaded Tom Brown, the best young illustrator of the day, to sketch a striding man in a napkin during a business lunch. In the stroke of a pen, the Victorian grocer was transformed into an Edwardian dandy. By 1920, Johnny's walk had taken him through 120 countries, and he continued walking through the brand's advertising over the next 50 years, into the fabric of global culture, deep into the dark hearts of several wars, to the pleasure palaces of the aristocracy, immortalised by screen legends, celebrated by filmmakers, singers, songwriters, novelists, shoulder to shoulder with the great sportsmen of the age, winning countless international awards for quality, and even being awarded the Royal Ward by King George V. No going back after that. Not that going back would even have occurred to Johnny or any of his family. By the end of the 20th century, the familiar red label and black label were joined by the green label, the gold label, and the grandest of them all, Johnny Walker Blue Label. By the beginning of the 21st century, Johnny Walker wasn't just the world's biggest whiskey brand, but an international symbol of progress. The brand's keep walking mantra, adopted by pro-democracy protesters and parliamentary speechwriters. What would the farm-born Victorian grocer have thought of all of this? He'd have loved it. A Victorian farm-born grocer he might have been, but he and the family that followed him were possessed by a fiery ambition with the skill and intelligence to match. 200 years later, and Johnny Walker's still walking, and he's not showing any signs of stopping.
Pretty cool ad, huh? Over 6 minutes long, and yet it holds your attention. It's even without a lot of visual action. It's just movement. The Scottish actor, really delivering those lines well. This is all done in one cut, and just walking right behind a dolly that is all set up and choreographed to the timing of the script. But it's the script that really makes that work. It's the advertising copy. Okay, here's a quick campaign I want to show you. And it kind of looks like it's a typical radio campaign, house campaign promoting a classic rock station.
Every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you. Every single day, every word you say, every game you play, every night you stay, I'll be watching you. Oh, can't you see? You belong to me. If what used to be your song now plays a different tune, you may be living an abusive relationship. Report. Call 1-800-91-ROCK-RADIO.
Okay, so that looks like it's going to be an ad for, a promotional ad for the radio station itself, and using the copy of classic rock lyrics, and then here's the second ad in that campaign.
We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out because I love you too much, baby. Why can't you see what you're doing to me when you don't believe a word I say? We can't go on together with suspicious minds. And we can't build our dreams on suspicious minds.
If what used to be your song now plays a different tune, you may be living an abusive relationship. Report. Call 1-800-91-ROCK-RADIO.
And the third one.
Talk to me softly. There's something in your eyes. Don't hang your head in sorrow. And please, don't cry. I know how you feel inside. I've been there before. Something is changing inside you, and don't you know? Don't you cry tonight. I still love you, babe. Don't you cry tonight. Don't you cry tonight. There's a heaven above you, babe. And don't you cry tonight. If what used to be your song now plays a different tune, you may be living an abusive relationship. Report. Call 1-800-91-ROCK-RADIO.
All right, let's look at some more headlines. So this ad for Ace Hardware is a good example of using a headline subhead combination to make the point. Back in the day, handyman wasn't a trade, it was a husband. Okay, here's another one where I have blocked the headline. And the headline visual interaction is the ad here. And you've seen 100 automotive ads like this. You know, the sports car on the curvy mountain road. It's beautiful. But for it to work, it can't just be an eye candy kind of shot, right? It has to have something more to go with it. So this ad for Aston Martin, the headline is protected by more prenups than any other car. Okay, let's look at another one like this. So this is an ad for the Volkswagen van, and it's celebrating the 60th anniversary of the VW van. It's done in that picture window layout style with lots of negative space, very similar to the style that Bernbach kind of created for Volkswagen advertising back in the 60s and 70s. But how would you write the headline for this to celebrate the fact that the Volkswagen van is 60 years old? So here's the copy. Love was everywhere the year you were born. Love on sheepskins, now moth-eaten. Love on thick pink polyester rugs, now burned to ashes. Love in communes, now long shut down. Love under trees that were cut down since. See the parallelism that is starting each sentence with love, right? Love on beaches, now washed away in countries with new names. Love without even taking off their now outdated clothes. Love on music nobody remembers, and following gurus now turned realtors. Come to think of it, apart from you and the Volkswagen van, there isn't much left of those years. The van is 60. Okay, the headline. It's unusual to drive the vehicle you were conceived in. Okay. Headline visual interaction there. Okay, Altoids. Altoids recreated themselves as a brand back in the mid-1990s with this campaign, Mints So Strong They Come in a Metal Box, and then the Curiously Strong Mints. And their whole advertising approach was headlines and then a visual of the product package. They actually did most of their promotion through college campuses, and they did a lot of sponsorship of NCAA sports, but the sports that didn't necessarily draw huge TV contracts. So they did a lot of on-site advertising and signage to support this kind of campaign. So they would be, supporting, sponsoring like, women's volleyball and wrestling and things like that. So really interesting campaign, and it was all built on headlines such as this one, or makes other mints feel inadequate. Okay, in this ad for Fever Tree tonic water, I want to look at both the headline, which I've blocked out, and we'll show you that in a minute, but also the copy block. This is almost a perfect example of a typical advertising 2D copy block structure. And this typical structure starts out with thematic sentences. And so that kind of introduces it, sets the tone, but doesn't really give you much product information in the first couple of sentences. It just kind of piques your interest and kind of creates this theme around the rest of the ad. And then from there, when it gets into the middle, it's going to focus on some features and benefits that we talked about earlier. And then in the end, it's going to have what's called a kicker. And a kicker is usually one short sentence at the end of the copy block, usually somewhat humorous, that relates back to the theme, and that provides your exit, kind of your entertaining exit. That's kind of like the cherry on top of the dessert at the end of the meal. So let's look at this copy block. The formula for a perfect gin and tonic isn't exactly rocket science. A little ice, your favorite premium gin, a curl of lime rind, and then in parentheses, it's the oil you're after, not the flesh, and a tonic that will enhance the flavor of your spirit without leaving a cloying aftertaste. That's where Fever Tree comes in. Like all of our mixers, Fever Tree tonic water uses only natural ingredients, such as cane sugar, instead of the saccharin found in more mainstream brands. Okay, that's the feature, right? It's these natural flavors that perfectly complement your choice of spirit and make for a more balanced taste. That's the benefit following the feature. And then the kicker, since it started out talking about rocket science, the kicker is you don't need a PhD to understand that can only be a good thing. And then the headline, fancy a gin and carbon 7, hydrogen 5, nitrogen, oxygen 3, and sulfur? Or thought not. Okay, that is, and I'm a geek, I looked it up, that's the chemical compound for saccharin. So fancy a gin and saccharin, thought not. Okay, last set of ads. Newcastle beer out of the UK has a long history of really clever advertising built just on artwork of the beer in a glass and then funny headlines. Okay. The world's first beer ad with this headline, and then No Bollocks is the theme line. Apparently, construction site advertising is the next big thing. Pairs well with food, and also no food. If you buy this beer at a bar, you will most likely get a coaster with it. If you like a beer named after a city in England, this is for you. We made this beer taste good in 1927. We haven't done much since. All right, that's all for today.